Hello and welcome back, and welcome to another one of the Blue Talks. This time we're going to have a conversation about something that's on everybody's lips, about fuels. What is the future fuels for shipping? What options do we have? Are we talking methanol, hydrogen, ammonia? Are we talking about electrification? Where is large ship owners? What are large ships? What are small ship owners? What are small ships going to actually opt for when it comes to this transition? So we're going to have a discussion from a regulatory point of view, from a science point of view, from the point of view of the business within this as well. So now it gives me great pleasure just to ask Jan Embelsvåg from NTNU, just to set the scene for us a little bit here, Jan, just to look at what are the options, where does it fit in, and from your point of view, how you see this transition of fuels. Are we going to have a single fuel in the future? Or how is hydrogen going to sit alongside ammonia, methanol, and anything else?
Well, I made a short presentation. I can see it there, but not here.
That is it.
I can just click?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay. So here are the requirements. By 2050, we have to cut in half, basically, compared to 2008. And as you can see here, we also need to reduce the GHG intensity by 40% by 2030 and 70% by 2050. And of course, you know about this index. That's how we calculate it. It's a key tool. And it's a so-called, oh no, it doesn't work like that, the pointer. It's a functional unit, as we call it, calculated per ton nautical mile. Applies to new builds, but current fleet will also face stiffer and stiffer regulation. So, the big question is, what should we do? Reduce speed, larger ships, different fuel, different engines, what? Okay, let's have a look at energy densities. And this is a very nice graph made by DNV. And you can see, I think all of you are familiar with this graph. And you see basically that LPG, LNG, once you include the equipment, it goes well into the red zone. Look at hydrogen. Looks very good here, but that's without the equipment. When you include the equipment, you go all the way in here. And the big problem is that you see none are in the dark green area. That's the problem. So, but let me give you some food for thought. Now, if this distance here was 1 meter, then, and now of course into nuclear, uranium would be 32 kilometers away from this scene, and thorium would be 38 kilometers away. It's an enormous difference in energy density. A size of thorium this size would power your life, including all the indirect energy you need, meaning building, road, everything, for your whole lifetime. Just this much. So, we have hazards. This you also know. Ammonia, you see we have some score on health. It's relatively toxic. You see hydrogen, flammability, and so on. These are also things you have to take into account. But I think one of the key things that I miss in today's debate is actually when we talk about sustainability, and here you see the social dimension, environmental dimension, and economic dimension, but what we miss is scale. It's all about scale, because the job we are going to do is so huge that if we don't have sufficient scale, it won't work. And now I'm going to illustrate this with a single calculation. Let's see, we had a ship going from Shanghai to Amsterdam. If this was a relatively large container vessel, it would consume 3,350 megawatt hour equivalent of energy per day. Heavy fuel oil has 11 megawatt hour per ton, which translates into 350 ton fuel per day. 3,900 tons each way. Green ammonia has 5 megawatt hour per ton, which means we need about twice as much. If we have 80% utilization of the ship, 12 trips per year, we will end up with a very staggering number. Let's look at this, green ammonia. We need to spend roughly 12 megawatt hours to make it. That will give us 2.2 terawatt hours per ship per year if we are going to fuel this vessel with green ammonia. In comparison, this is number for 2020 from Norway. The entire wind farm production in Norway would almost power 5 such ships. There are 580 such large container ships in the world. They would require 1,280 terawatt hour per year, or almost half of Europe's total energy production. This is the scale. And this is just container vessels. We can add cruise vessels, big tankers, cruise vessels, dry bulkers, special ships, not to mention airlines, truckers. The job is to transform the primary energy. That's a really big task, and we need to think big. Otherwise, we won't make it. So that means, when it comes to these ships, what to do. And I think personally, I'm there that no size fits all. I think we have to look at different solutions for different kind of ships. But we always have to ask ourselves, how will this translate if it was really big scale? If we do believe in, let's say, this one can go on hydrogen, what would that mean? Is there enough energy to create all the hydrogen? This one is typically nuclear, and as the US Navy say, 30 knots for 30 years or more. Is there enough uranium? Oh yes, there is. And so on. We need to ask these questions. So I think that was the opening, and I think now the conversation is the next.
Yes, it certainly is. Jan, thank you very much for painting that rather bleak picture.
Well, it's not bleak. I think we have to be realistic.
True.
About the challenge.
True. I mean, that's a lot of windmills that you'll need to create.
Yes, I calculated it. If you want to create all the wind power for these 580 ships, you would need 125,000 square kilometers of windmills, which is about a third of the entire Norwegian landmass.
And that's just if we were looking at ammonia?
Yes.
But that's ammonia across the whole, as you said in the end, that's ammonia for the whole global fleet?
No, for the 580.
Oh,
just for the 580.
Okay.
If it was the global fleet, then I would be much more,
So, I mean, when I bring the panelists up there, we're going to look at how this sort of splits up a little bit and that sort of pathways to go. But I wanted to touch on the nuclear aspect here, because I'm going to come back to that with the panel as well, so the pros and cons of nuclear in this. Nuclear, you're saying, in terms of energy density, is a big tick. Okay, in terms of radiation and in terms of energy security, there's other questions that have to be raised around there. But do you see, in terms of the technology and how the shipping industry can evolve, that there is a place in commercial shipping for nuclear, not military, but commercial?
Absolutely, and keep in mind that in 1962, Norway actually voted for yes in the IMO meeting concerning nuclear vessels. And back then, it was the dawn of pressurized water reactors. The ships worked very well. It's just that the cost was too high. With today's modern reactor, which is typically fourth-generation reactors, we talk about reactors that are maybe 50 times more effective than today's nuclear power plants, and they can be manufactured very small. So we've done a study on this, just preliminary. For example, to power a big LNG vessel, you need a reactor core of roughly 8 by 8 by 8 meters. That's it. Would fit under this roof. Then, of course, comes the turbines, load and management system, all this in addition. And these modern reactors, they create very, very little waste because they burn up the fuel so much more. Like I said, up to 50 times, and theoretically, actually 100 times more than conventional nuclear power.
Good. Well, can I invite our panel to come up now, please, because I want to sort of broaden this. Obviously, I'm not going to have a full hour talking about nuclear, but I may come back into elements of this as I get the panel. So here we've got Heidi Bolden from Norled, and Norled, as many of you who are Norwegian will know, has been leading the way when it comes to fuel transformation to a large extent, and the whole sort of decarbonisation, because that's part of the kind of remit that you've been given within Norled. Sophia Furstenberg Stott I've known for a long time, and she's been actively involved in this development of fuels and the development of the other story, particularly with ammonia and elements like that, looking at how it fits in an equitable way. So not just the large ship owners that can afford this and maybe invest in being a leadership role, but how mid-sized, smaller companies can actually be part of this transition as well, because we've got to have the whole industry moving along with us here. Thomas, I've known you since your DNV days, and I know you two knew each other from your joint DNV days, but obviously I've known you also when you were working in the joint venture, looking at how fuel cells will fit into the industry, and now you're working within Wilhelmsen and developing certain areas, and I wanted you on this panel as well to talk about Topeka and some of the other activities that you're in, and we'll touch on the electrification as well. And of course, Feig, I've known you from Transport and Environment, and you've been very active in lobbying in Europe about the whole transformation, and most importantly, speeding it up. And you want to see kind of Europe leading the way to some extent, giving a kick to the IMO, I dare say, to be able to get the IMO to also move along a lot quicker. So I'm going to start actually with you, Feig, because I want to get a sort of political flavour, if you like, here, of what's good, what's bad, in terms of that list of fuels that you saw, nuclear, and we're going to touch on LNG as well, of course, because I know you're quite vocal about that. What for you are the good fuels and the bad fuels here, and why? Can you sort of encapsulate that in a few sentences?
That's a tough one because you have a big presentation on different types of fuels, and what we know is the future of shipping is not going to be a single fuel, but we also know that it's not going to be 20 fuels. The industry cannot live with 20 fuels. It's a global industry, it's an international industry, it needs to be refueling in different ports, and we cannot expect every port having a list of bunkering options available for everyone. So eventually we're looking to 2 or 3 options, and the key word that Jan before me talked about, scale. And I would update that word and make it scalable as opposed to scale itself. Whatever the solutions are, we believe that it needs to respond to 3S principle. Number 1, it needs to be suitable, technically suitable. If it doesn't work in shipping, then we don't need to waste our time on that. Secondly, it needs to be sustainable, meaning that the job is shifting the fuel is promote environmental sustainability and climate sustainability. If the fuel doesn't deliver it, then there is no point in changing from one fuel to another one. And number 3, it needs to be scalable. There are certain fuels that can be sustainable in small amounts, but if you're trying to scale it up, then you are not meeting that. We believe that the only fuel types that can meet all these 3S principles are the fuels that will be based on green hydrogen, because hydrogen can be produced from green electricity, even though the scale that Jan earlier mentioned, the number of windmills that we'll need to build or the solar panels we need to install, they are quite big. The planet has enough resources, renewable resources, to meet the needs of all sectors. It is big numbers, we need to make quite a lot of effort, but the space is there. We just need to make sure that we use it the most efficiently as possible, because it's not only a question of space, it's a question of time. If you don't use it efficiently, you're running out of time, out of carbon budget to meet the needs of the global temperature goals.
And go on, Jan.
Yes. There's one way of doing this also, which could start really fast, and that is to generate synthetic fuel by the rest heat from a nuclear facility. For example, Hinkley Point C in the UK, when that comes online, you can produce 600,000 tons of hydrogen from it, or almost 3 million tons of ammonia, if there is a market to
I know that there's been efforts in the US as well to do that, and one of the points that they raise is most nuclear plants are by large areas of water because they need the water for the cooling. So it's relatively easy to get that hydrogen if you can make it, build up a plant to generate the hydrogen and then export it or use it in shipping if it need be.
Just to quickly respond to nuclear. I mean, on nuclear, my organization has taken a convenient position not to have a position. That helps us a lot, but I'll share my personal opinion. Nuclear, at least as we have known it as a fission nuclear, is a dying breed. That's the way we see it. Putting on ships is as problematic as keeping on land for safety reasons, for waste reasons, and so on. But for shipping, there's one additional challenge. Ships, again, as I mentioned, they travel international, they call at different ports. If a country like Italy has banned nuclear on its territory, that means a nuclear-powered vessel will not be able to call at Italian port, and you have a logistical problem. And the number of those countries who have banned or will be banning in the near future is increasing. So there is a bit of a problem in thinking about that line. Fusion nuclear, that's the next generation. We keep an open mind to that, but the first experimental reactor will be ready in 20 years' time, but turning it into commercial reactor, well, we keep an open mind. I personally keep a lot of open mind on that one, but this is not for tomorrow.
No, I agree.
When it comes to using nuclear on land to create energy to be used, hydrogen or hydrogen-based fuels on ships, we think that it's going to be part of the mix. We don't I personally do not think every single molecule, green hydrogen molecule, will come from immediately renewable. Probably there will be a mix because those electrolyzers need to have long running hours to make it commercially viable. So there will be a bit of a, mix in the fuel. The question for us is, can you scale it up? Because that was the gist of your presentation. Can we scale it up? Because we don't really have a lot of acceptance and quite a lot of capacity with those waste heat energy from the nuclear power plants. If we cannot scale it up, do we need to put all of our eggs in that basket or search for alternatives elsewhere?
Good. Let me bring in some of the other panel now as well. So I want to sort of move along. So as I say, I don't want to stay too much on the whole nuclear. But in terms of scaling here, Heidi, I know that the scaling has been one of those things that has been kind of under discussion in Norway for a long time because some of the small projects then became larger and larger. And one of the examples is LNG, how that became sort of pockets of LNG-powered vessels, and then it scaled up around. And now electrification is scaling up. So from Norled as a ferry operator up and down the coastline of Norway, how have you seen the progress that you've been making as a ship operator, bearing in mind you went to LNG and now you're having to move on? In a way, you probably started at LNG, think, we've got a good stepping stone. Everybody's telling us they don't want LNG now, let's go off and find something else. Is this scaling of one system and then another system so soon afterwards a benefit because you've learned from how to scale with LNG? Or is it a case of, no, here we go again, it's something different now?
Good question. First, sort of from a Norled perspective, we have been sort of fortunate to be a spearhead, I would say, within the green shift for the maritime industry. And I think it's very suitable for ferry and express boats to be a spearhead. From our perspective, we will use batteries as long as we can because it's cheapest. And also then you can reduce more CO2. So that's kind of a stand from our perspective. And people, I think the story is quite well known from we introduced MFM Pier in 2015 as the world's first electrical ferry. Now it's 80 electrical ferry on the Norwegian fjords. So, and then we have, our stand is that on long distances, it's hydrogen. We are open for other things as well, but it's hydrogen, our current stand, because perhaps it's ammonia when you're coming even further distances than us. But the fall, we will set into operation the world's first hydrogen ferry on liquid hydrogen.
Okay.
So very excited about that, and also. We have set a target of having a fleet where we have reduced CO2 reduction from 2019 with 67% by 2030, which is quite near. And since we Since we are a spearhead, perhaps we can run a bit faster. For us now, the next is express boat.
Okay.
So you can perhaps compare to the flight industry. It's very high CO2 per passenger, and also you have high speed. So you need to take different circumstances into consideration. It needs to be very lightweighted and so forth. So there we are looking into a battery swap solution, so still batteries. We are planning to do the swap by 3 minutes. So when the boat is coming to a quay, we're going to shift the batteries, and then we're going to continue further in 30 to 35 knots. So that's what we're working on, and it will be fully operational by 2024. And then coming back to the politics then. Yes, we need sort of consistency and predictability. So what is good for us and what is good for others as well, I think, is if you can long contracts, technological neutral, so you can explore on other concepts, so you can find what is most suitable. I think we are still in a phase where we need to explore before we are concluding. And then we need to be scalable. We also need to take into consideration also the cost. So I still think that the lowest cost per CO2 is important in the scaling debate.
Yeah. And how do you see that? I'll bring Sophia into this now, because I want to talk about that scalability. Because you've got an ability within certain companies that have got government contracts and that have got a remit to be part of that. You've got large companies that have got the ability to invest in that, but you've got smaller companies, you've got the larger part of the industry, really, that is looking, watching, waiting, seeing what comes out on the legislative front, looking at what comes out technology. I mean, how complex is it for them? I know you've been working with some clients of yours that are in the sort of mid-size owners. How kind of fearful, how doubtful are they about the future? How uncertain are they about what steps they are going to have to take? I mean, do they look at it, at this whole discussion and just go, whoa, I nearly want to just go and do something else?
Yes, thank you, Craig, for that question. I think a lot of the smaller ship owners are really struggling a lot to understand what could actually a very first step be. And like you say, they take a step back and then tend to wait. And I think if they wait, they may be out of business very soon. And so the first thing I would like to say there is that they need to work more on how they engage strategically in this question. Even if there are not solutions that they can engage in today, how can they engage on that journey? And with that, it's about looking outside that common envelope of how they are doing their business. Can they start collaborating more with their cargo owners, for instance? Can they, God forbid, start collaborating with their competitors? How can they share risk? And how can they find mutual value on that journey? And concrete examples that we see is taking place a lot here in Norway as well, where we see examples of little clusters, synergy-driven, value-driven consortiums, where you have a ship owner, you have a port, you have an energy producer, you have an island who is interested in decarbonizing. And so to identify those regional synergies and engage in that conversation is, I think, a very important starting point. But my main message is really that smaller ship owners need to engage in this question strategically.
Do they even know what questions to ask? I don't mean that flippantly. I'm not saying the ship owners themselves are stupid or that they aren't engaging or they don't want to engage, but I say, do they know how to have that discussion about the potential of these fuels and where they're going to fit in?
I need to be careful of what I say here, Craig. But what I meet out there is a lot of, ambition. People are really excited. They want to do the right thing. They don't have the resources to send a secondee to the Zero Carbon Center in Copenhagen. They can't engage in that level. And so they struggle to identify how they can engage.
Because that's my concern there. It sounds like there has to be a certain amount of pay to play in this discussion element here, that you've got companies that they don't have the resources, they don't have the capital, and they can't be part of that. They're not a Wilhelmsen. They're not a company that's got large capital and resources and will invest and be a leader. So there is, as you say, that danger of getting left behind because they can't pay to play and be part of the transformation.
But I really believe in looking at that entire value chain. And for instance, what if several of the ammonia producers engaged with ship owners, ammonia carriers, and launched together the first ammonia-driven ammonia carrier, shared that risk and explored that together and taken that initiative, because people are struggling to collaborate in new ways, and they are afraid of their little envelope of competitive advantage, but I would encourage them to explore that space.
Yeah. And there's also the fear factor and trust that you need to bring into that as well. So Thomas, electrification, fuel cells. Well, let's talk about Topeka. Do I pronounce that right? Topeka? Topeka?
Topeka.
Topeka? Let's have a topic about Topeka then. So explain Topeka to me, or refresh my mind.
Yeah, but it's exactly addressing a little bit what we have been discussing here. It's the little ship owner. How can he really be secure and feel confident about this new technology? And so Topeka was about a group of companies that really wanted to make their own universe to break and crack the chicken and egg dilemma. So you could see the technology working and get some kind of see and feel exposure. Topeka was about building a production plant of quite small size of liquid hydrogen, using that hydrogen on board a vessel, transporting hydrogen from the North Sea bases to other bases along with goods. So taking goods from the road onto the sea, which is also things we need, and distributing that. Now we didn't quite get where we wanted because the production plant has been put on ice for the time being. So without any hydrogen, we can't continue the vessel as such with liquid. We are looking into several ways of doing, of changing that for the time being. Well, that's what I want to say. But yeah, that was the thing. Try, and I think we have this discussion now, top down. What is it that really would make kind of the world go to a better direction? And then bottom up. You have the ship owners who have their business and really need technology that they can rely on. They want availability, they want something that they can trust. And all this new technology, I have so much understanding about that risk, and especially the feeling of risk.
Right.
So it's about kind of demonstrating that and get people to see and be aware that this technology is here. And we will get there. There's a little bit tumbling stone now with the Aurora project, but we will get back on track with time.
Hey, let's look at some of the other fuels. I know you're outspoken about LNG and what you consider to be a dead-end fuel, effectively. But there was a report that came out today from Clarksons, and it was their Q1 new building report, and they said that it is the largest percentage of new buildings in the first quarter of a year that have got new fuels, what they call sort of alternative fuels, and they put LNG in as the alternative fuel still. I'm guessing you don't see LNG as an alternative fuel there. It shouldn't be listed in that. But my point is, you may say that LNG is not the road to go down, but the evidence shows that there's a lot of ship owners that completely disagree and are ordering LNG-powered vessels. Some of them, interestingly, there was a large percentage, or not large, but there was a percentage that were going to be powered by LNG but are ammonia-ready as well, whatever ammonia-ready may mean in this context. But tell me, just remind everybody, what's your position on LNG, and then I'll start challenging you again on it.
Craig, it's a very interesting one, because I also remember that a few years ago we were disagreeing with the car manufacturers that diesel engines are a terrible idea, yet majority of European, at least, car manufacturers went down that road. Now they're reversing their course. We believe that with LNG it's going to be the same if we get the policies right. At the moment, the policy space is designed in a way that it extremely favors LNG. At least if you take into account the pre-crisis LNG prices, the price of the fuel. We have the air pollution regulations that make LNG compliant, certainly. It's not the problem with the regulation, it's just like one of the unintended consequences. And then we don't have anything on greenhouse gases on a life cycle basis, at least not in place just yet. We believe that move to LNG is a result of a combination of the air pollution as well as the former market trends. And that there is a lot of role for the fossil industry lobbies. I think that the political dimension should not be ignored. It's not just a ship owner making a rational choice, but there is a lot of incentive or push coming from the political space. What is the problem with LNG? LNG is a fossil fuel, it still emits GHG. You cannot decarbonize any sector, let alone shipping, with switching to LNG. We have a report from IPCC that was published last week and shows the challenge of the decarbonization pathway that we need to follow. And it explicitly said, IPCC report explicitly said, natural gas or natural gas-based solutions are inadequate to meet the needs of 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. It is explicit. I could even really think about the kind of quote the actual page and the line where it was. Secondly, when LNG is promoted as a fuel, they think that LNG vessels will be compatible with other fuels such as biomethane, which is biofuel.
Well, everybody uses that phrase. I think the phrase
Exactly.
is transition.
Transitional.
Yeah.
And it sounds good, it sounds intuitive, but when you look into the details, you see a big problem there. First of all, how much sustainable biomethane potential is there? I'm not talking about the production today, that is irrelevant. We're talking about the feedstock to make it fuel. And there you see a big problem because biomethane is a product that is used not only, or that is aspired for not only by ships, but by all other sectors. Looking at the households, looking at electricity production, we see that there is not enough sustainable feedstock there to meet the needs of everyone. Sure. Secondly, especially in light of the geopolitical crisis that we are facing, we have 40% of our natural gas coming from Russia, and we are trying to somehow fix that problem. Are we not better off using that, whatever available sustainable biomethane we have in the power sector to reduce the dependence on an aggressive country, as opposed to creating a new demand in a sector that traditionally did not rely on natural gas?
Yep.
And that is the dilemma that we have. And number three, the costs. When you're looking at biomethane, you can have certain volumes, right, potential, but they come in brackets of different costs. If you produce biomethane from sludge, from sewage, from landfill, it's going to be relatively, the keyword is relatively, cheaper. It's going to be still more expensive than LNG, but relatively cheaper. But the volumes will be very limited. There is only so much landfill, and it's decreasing, right? Yeah. And the same on the sewage side. You can produce from manure, you can produce from agricultural waste, but when you're looking at the cost, they are up to 30 times the cost of LNG today. Who's going to be using that fuel and be still competitive in the market? And that's the problem is. For this reason, and the other alternative is e-LNG, producing the same molecule, but from different source, from hydrogen and CO2 from air capture. We believe that that could be sustainable and scalable because there is enough CO2 in the atmosphere, there is enough hydrogen production capacity, possibility rather. Then we come to the same question of, it's going to be costly, but will it be cheaper or more expensive than other alternatives, especially direct use of hydrogen, direct use of electricity in batteries, or using it in the form of ammonia? We believe that it can be sustainable and scalable, but it will not be cost effective.
It will be not cost benefit
compared to others.
Yeah.
Yes, I think when we look at the overall climate gas emissions from shipping, it's about 2-3% of the total emissions in the world. About 80% of this, or actually I think 87%, is from the large ships.
Yes.
So that means that the remaining 13% of 2-3% is what come from the smaller ships. And I think we have to be much more pragmatic when it comes to the smaller ships. I think, for example, if we use bio gas, in a true sense, meaning coming from, waste, I think that's a good thing. But what we see today is that actually leads to deforestation. They are chopping down a lot of trees in the south in the US and also in the Baltics, transporting it to make so-called green fuel. 800 scientists submitted a letter to the EU demanding it's being banned. So when it comes to these gases, it has to be from landfill. Then I think it's a very good solution. When it comes to gas from oil and gas, so to speak, the fossil version, it solves a lot of problems. You know, you get rid of particle matters, you get maybe 20% less emissions. And when you look at the ships that we're now talking
What
about...
about methane slip? What about methane slip?
That's included in that.
He disagrees. Like, I'm not looking at him, but I know he's shaking.
Yeah. But the point is, we're talking about the 13% of the 3%.
Right.
So the most important for these ships that goes, for example, into cities and so on, is to get rid of the particles.
Right.
That gives local pollution. What, for example, a ferry do in a global perspective is almost uninteresting.
Okay.
In terms of emissions. So I would like to see a much more pragmatic approach to the smaller ships, and then we should focus on solving the big ones that are really the challenge.
Yeah. Quickly to react to that, I mean, two issues. Number one, the argument that LNG reduces emissions by 20% is factually, to say the least, incorrect. It depends on the engine type.
Yes, of course.
Four-stroke engines are worse than diesel engines when it's used with fossil natural gas because the methane slippage is very high. Two-stroke low-pressure engines deliver about 3 to 4%, and only high-pressure engines, which is the minority in the market, can deliver up to 16%. It's not only methane slippage on the engine, but also production and transportation and bunkering, all of that. How much can you go with 16%? In terms of decarbonization. When it comes to landfill and the biomethane, where to use it, production of biomethane from waste, the final product is a gaseous product, it's gas. To be used on ship, it needs to be liquefied. You have about 10 to 35% penalty there, depending on the size of the facility. If you are a business company, why would you prefer taking the hit of 10 to 35% penalty on the product to sell it to ships if you can sell 100% of it to the grid, right? We all have our boilers. There is electricity production. It seems like it's not only not competitive, it's not desirable at all, because you already have the gasket, you already have the boilers. Why to replace those with something else, with more expensive, as opposed to use whatever the available biomethane
Sophia now. I just want to get her input.
volumes that we have.
Thank you, Craig. I think there's a topic missing from this conversation. We've talked about the need to be able to scale. We have a lot of kind of resource conversation about is there enough of the resources. And I think even though it's not a fuel, I think it's a pity that we are not including wind into this conversation. We have a lot of uncertainty today, and the variance of wind is known. So it's an uncertainty that we can handle. We know the variance of wind. And so when we are looking into the future and looking at the high costs involved of that ammonia fuel, of that methanol fuel and so on, let's look at combining design solutions. And let's look at how much can we use wind to de-risk ammonia? How much can we use wind to de-risk other fuels option, and come up with solutions that are taking that holistic perspective. And I'm not talking about wind assist, because for many of the trades out there, it is possible to use wind as a main propulsion. It's a business model challenge. And I am sick and tired of hearing those conversations that are just stopping right there and saying, no, wind is not for us, it's a petty opportunity out there, because they are stuck in a way of thinking. And so I would like to see that conversation taking place where we are combining these possible solutions.
I think the conversation also has to be revolving around whether we're talking about new builds and retrofits, because we've got an existing fleet that is going to be in service. Some of them are relatively young. You may argue that they've made wrong design decisions 5 years ago in terms of how they've been designed, but they're going to be in service because there's that financial
But Craig, how many years is it going to take to build out the wind infrastructure? So, I mean, of course we need to focus on the existing fleet as well. But let's not forget where we put our money right now.
We can retrofit in terms of wind assist. Sorry, Heidi, you're going to interrupt there as well, I think.
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking that it is a lot of dilemmas because we also need to move. I think we need to understand where, in many ways, we are doing too many pilots because we need to get up scale. At the same time, we need to get the right pilots and more pilots so we can try to confirm what we would like to sort of go ahead with. And in that regard, I think that not only kind of ferries and express boat, but can also sort of nearshore shipping is relevant because it's a little bit less costly. So you need the spearheads, I think. And I also very much support that we also need to think than multiple things at the same time. And by that, also the commercial and business aspect comes in as well. It's back to sort of predictability, but we need also the right drivers. We need a CO2 tax.
Yes.
So it's so it's getting costly to not move along, and we need incentives to be technological neutral, both when it comes to public funding and when it also comes to kind of contracts regime, so forth. So it's certainly dilemmas when it comes to energy sources, but also we need to talk about what is the right framework to move ahead on something that is good also in the long run, not only in the short run.
I'm going to move to Thomas before I go back to Jan there.
Question to one of the, maybe even you, and this is the kind of, there are coming up new economies around this. So let's say the bioplant producing a lot of CO2, which today actually from bioplants mostly are just vented out into the atmosphere. And that CO2 has a value because when we want to really go green, you should capture that. So new business models are coming up that could make biofuel an advantage because they will pay for that CO2 and they will deposit and get the credit and sell that. And my question to you was, how do you look at, a bioplant consists of methane and CO2 that's coming out. That is actually the building bricks for methanol. It's a little bit not the right concentration, so you need some green hydrogen to kind of water it out in a way to the right concentrations, and then you can build methanol, which is carbon neutral and green. And of course, the question is how the taxonomy will look at that. But from your point of view, how would that be?
It's a good question. The CO2 source for the synthetic fuels is the big challenge. If you take it from fossil fuels, meaning from cement production or coal power plant, you have a problem. It's the same CO2 that comes under the ground. So this is, we ignore. Second source is direct air capture. That is the most sustainable one. It's the circular one. And then the biogenic one is somewhere in between. Why? Because the main problem there is how much CO2 can you scale up from the biogenic sources. The CO2 limit in the biogenic production is the same as the availability of biofeedstock. There was an interesting calculation. Denmark wants to produce synthetic kerosene. It's a similar process to producing e-fuels for ships, and use biogenic sources for that e-kerosene. They realized that if they take all of the sustainable biogenic source of CO2 and turn it into plain fuel, e-kerosene, they will be able to fuel 1/3 of all the flights taking off from Copenhagen. 1/3 only.
Yeah.
What happened? What's left to ships then? So there is a bit of a scale issue that we are kind of hitting exactly the same wall. We do not think that it is impossible to have e-methanol sustainably and scalably, but it needs to come from sources that do not have the same barriers, do not have the same limits.
I'd argue then, it's going back onto something that Sophia was saying in terms of sort of looking at wind as a solution. There are ship designs out there where the focus is on having the fuel, but doing your best not to use the fuel.
Yes.
Putting everything on board you can, whether it's a Flettner rotor, whether it's some other sort of power saving or waste heat recovery system. So, because one of the things I say about that, when you're talking about like for like in terms of power densities of the fuels is, yes, diesel's up there as sort of like the 1.0 on the scale, and everything else looks worse in terms of power density, but this is the incentive to not use as much fuel, regardless of what it is. Of course, we're going to have that cost issue, the scale issue, the availability issue. So putting all these technologies in. So if you look at the projects, if you look at what's going on, you'll see that there is all this effort not to use the fuel, even if it is an alternative fuel. So it's not like for like, is it?
Indeed. I mean, the original graph that Jan showed, I mean, it's a very informative one, but at the same time, it can be a bit misleading, depending on where you're looking at. A few years ago, when we said that, we need to have battery electric cars, car manufacturers said, with a 50 kilogram fuel tank today, and diesel car can go 500 kilometers.
Yeah.
Can you design an electric car that has 50 kilogram battery and has the same mileage? So it's impossible, but that's the wrong question. The right question is, can you design a car that's run on battery that goes the same autonomy, that has the same autonomy? The answer is yes, we have those cars today. I think the same goes with a ship design. Those alternative fuels might not have the same density of diesel that it's supposed to replace, but you can design the vessel in a way that has exactly the same autonomy running on ammonia, for example. And we have seen those designs already out there. The question is, are we going to get the engine in place? I'm looking at MAN in time so that those ships can run all of those. And there, wind comes very handy, because if you can cut quite a lot of the energy requirement by simply directly using wind, that means that you don't need to lose a lot of cargo space by switching to alternative low-density fuels. And the last element, every now and then I have a curiosity to look at the autonomy of different vessels. And some of the vessels in the fleet have capacity to go all around the planet on a single fuel, bunkering.
Okay.
Do you really need that?
In other words, they're overloaded.
They are
Overbunkered.
Yeah, the autonomy is too big. I mean, the future, especially with low-density fuels, will be increased frequency of bunkering, as opposed to just bunkering at one spot and going around several months.
I go to Sophia.
Yes, I would like to comment. We've several conversations here about battery. And I think when we are in this phase where we are looking into the future and building up infrastructure, we have a responsibility to look at the circular perspective. And I would strongly like to point out the need that we have to have a focus on where are those metals going to come from what regions, how are we going to make sure that we are not creating another problem by solving the problem our industry has, and looking to novel ways to engage in that project context from that circular perspective. Because that's another scaling issue. How are we going to produce all those batteries? And where is it coming from?
Okay. I'll take that one straight to Thomas.
I don't have any good answer for that, sorry. I'm not a battery manufacturer, so, but...
But you, in terms of when you're sitting on the mix, actually you probably have an idea on this as well, because you've got electrified systems now, so you'll be putting batteries on some of your vessels.
I totally agree that we need to think circular. And if you're thinking also about what has happened with the ferry, we have actually said that all ferries that are newer than 1992 can be retrofitted for battery. That's also circular thinking. Also now, when we are looking into express boats, we also had talks with the public funding related to not necessarily building new ones, but retrofit the existing. So I totally agree on the circular thinking. And when it comes to battery, it's also about the demands from us towards, and I think we will, hearing that we're starting to see different business models also where they're bringing back so they can reuse kind of.
I know there's pending regulation in Europe about recycling of batteries, cars. It's predominantly based around the electrification of cars, but it will fit into maritime batteries, in that batteries have to have the ability to be recycled, and those rare earth metals actually reused in there. Because I was We did have a Blue Talk yesterday on circular economy. Unfortunately, the guy who was from Battery Return got COVID, so he couldn't turn up. But during the conversation I had with him before, he mentioned this, and he said, Craig, the efficiencies in batteries have gone up so much, we can take out the rare earth metals from an old battery and put it into 2 batteries.
Yes.
You know, that's how efficient the batteries are, how much more power you're getting out of it. So to some extent, that's a good story kind of to tell. Was that what you were going to?
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Okay, so can I skip you then and go to Jan?
Yes, and like you say, I think it's very important to look at the entire life cycle of things. If we look at the total energy consumption in the world, over the last 20 years, depending on how you calculate it, if you use the direct method, we have improved 1.5%, less fossil than, the ratio between renewables and fossil have improved by 1.5% over 20 years. If you use the substitution method that IPC uses, it's 3%. Why? Because what we've done in Europe is that we have moved a lot of the dirty processing part that you need for all these metals, we have moved to Asia.
Okay.
The Asians need to build energy power to make it work. So the total sum is almost the same. And to make these rare earth elements, for example, 80% of today's endangered species are endangered because of mining.
Yeah.
20% of them because of climate change.
But are we largely agreed, though, that whatever option we're going for, there's a lot of negative?
Yes, but
there's a lot of on the negative, on the pluses and minuses. There's a lot on the negative list of anything we're going to go for, isn't there?
yeah, but I just have to say all about this waste thing in nuclear. If this was a nuclear storage,
You really want nuclear, don't you?
it's the only one that can give enough power. If you look at this hall and the next hall, 17 meters high, that's the combined nuclear storage in the US after
Jan?
60 years.
Who are the main suppliers of uranium today?
That's Kazakhstan is one of them. But both China, US and Japan are now developing a method for extracting it directly from the sea. Because in the sea there is 4.6 billion tons of uranium, and it's coming from the bedrock because, believe it or not, inside Earth it's a huge nuclear reactor. And it's pumping out into the world ocean roughly 16,000 tons of uranium every year. So now China have actually announced they're going to build an industrial facility for it, while the Japanese and the Americans are still on the R&D phase. So the uranium supply is completely solved. You don't have to open up a single land-based mine for uranium.
I think you're saying that, but at the same time, if we remember in the opening conference, there was talking about energy security. Now, to a large extent, if you've got countries, developing countries in particular, that are able to generate their own electricity using their own wind and solar resources, that is an element of energy security. Whether you're getting the oil from Russia or the Middle East, or whether you're getting your uranium from China, from
or from the ocean,
or from, well, how many countries are actually going to be able to develop that as a solution in the near future, let alone in the sort of like in 20 years' time, to it become a viable solution?
It's actually very straightforward. What they do is to put wool in the sea, yes.
Wool?
Or the Chinese have a industrial fabric that they use.
Or from sheep?
No. But the point is that there is uranium in the sea, and it keeps sticking to this, and they can make uranium yellow cake at roughly 3 times higher cost than today's mined uranium.
Sorry, I thought, Thomas, you had something to add.
I don't know, but I think my bet is that when we meet here again 2 years from now on the next North Sea conference, we will be talking about nuclear much more.
Okay.
Because I think we need all of it. We need all the solutions out there. Because if we could orchestrate this, if we could have a world ruler to say this is how we do it, it would be good. We don't have. So everything has to be tried out. There will be a myriad of solutions, and we will fight to find the best way, and everybody will have some of that. Well,
that goes against what you were saying. What Feig was saying, you don't want a myriad of such. We don't want 20 or 30 solutions. I got the impression you were talking about sort of 5 or 7 or 8 solutions that were scalable, so that you would keep the prices down, not a myriad of solutions. I'm just going to go we only got about 5 minutes left, so Sophia.
Thank you, Craig. You mentioning the word energy security, and I think the maritime industry has come to a place where we are a catalyst for the energy transition globally. As Maritime is developing solutions and building infrastructure around the world, they are kind of creating the decarbonization globally. So it's a fantastic space that we are in. But when this happens, we also need to take the conversation about who are the other sectors that are looking for these decarbonized energy sources, and who are we competing with, and where can it be best placed? Where can it do the best, kind of give the best benefits on a global scale? And that's another question that this industry has the responsibility to engage in, because we are building that foundation now. And when there are fuels or energy sources that are better used for decarbonizing agriculture or airplanes or whatever it be, let's have that discussion and let's look at that.
Well, that comes down to what Jan was saying about how much is available for shipping. If you go back to that container story and ammonia, your indication there isn't enough electricity for shipping to be part totally taking all of that. There wouldn't be anything left for any other.
No, and that's because we want to go to a phase where we have less energy efficiency. And if you look at human history, we have always progressed towards higher and higher energy efficiency. The transition, if you read a fabulous book by Václav Smil called Energy Transitions, he covered the whole history. The last transition took about 50 years from sail ships to engines. Why? Because it was profitable. And I think in this case too, we need a solution that cuts cost or has some other benefit. For example, increase speed, increase this or that. If we are going to subsidize ourselves into this into this green transition, it won't happen.
I think it's a good segue to, just mindful of the time, to switch to debate on policy. Because if the last transition happened on its own because it was profitable, we know that all those costs that we discussed today, they are more expensive than the fuels they're supposed to replace. And that's the role for the policy, to create a level playing field, to make sure that if we are transitioning step by step, that everybody follows the same rule, at least in a certain geography, and the other geographies following suit. And what type of regulations do we need to put in place to make it happen? We believe that we need to have three-pronged solution. Number one, we need to have a demand predictability from shipping industry. Nobody's going to build those windmills that you mentioned if they don't know that they will be able to sell that fuel to shipping industry. Maybe they will produce that fuel, but they will sell it to somebody else who is regulated. So there needs to be demand predictability. Number two, there needs to be supply predictability. The ship cannot be expected to produce its own fuel. Yeah. There are some new business models out there, but this is not the core of shipping business. They buy the fuel, they operate the vessel. There needs to be supply predictability. And number three, infrastructure imports. Obviously, all of this comes secondary to first what you can do, and that is energy efficiency. The best energy is the one that you don't use. And that's where it comes, speed reduction, wind technologies, and everything else you can do on board of the vessel to reduce the energy consumption. All of this, we believe, that will only happen if it is mandated by regulation. And when it comes to that mandate, we have put our hopes in the European regulation, because IMO has become too slow, and it has been recognized even by the IPCC report that came out last week, that we need to have both national and international regulatory frames to make it happen. We don't have the luxury to be picky on one or the other.
But I would also argue when he's talking about policy, and this comes back just to the last minute here, Sophia, when you've got the larger companies and the smaller companies, the ones with the largest voice tends to be the larger companies. So if there's larger companies who are pro-LNG, or are pro-methanol, or pro-ammonia, or pro-electrification, they will be the ones that get heard. And it might not be that they are actually lobbying for the right reason. They're lobbying because they have got economic interests, not environmental interests. How do you resolve that when you're looking at the complete industry, Sophia?
I think it's an extremely important question, and it goes back to the classic business example of why the VHS won the race of the video cassette. It wasn't the best solution, but they were best to reach the market. And I think in order to get forward in that kind of dilemma, we need to educate each other. We need to help each other to demystify and reduce complexity and have those conversations, because we are all overwhelmed with information right now. So that's maybe my key point there.
Good. Well, look, maybe we've helped with that a little bit today with this panel. Maybe not. Maybe we've added confusion, more clarity, but we are completely out of time, though. Thank you to the 5 of you for your inputs and thoughts here, and it was good to have a discussion about this. No, we solved nothing, but hopefully we gave some more questions to people to go away with. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.